And now fresh developments post that meeting between Russian and American guests. American president joining me on the broadcast are Alison and Mitchell. In fact, Mitchell, let me come to you first in terms of, as I said, the bonhomie, the handshakes, the good optics, all of that has happened. Now you're getting fresh updates. You're getting the fact that Donald Trump has told in no uncertain terms to Ukrainian President Zelensky that he will have to accept the deal, and that deal will only go through if there are some sort of territorial swaps.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways is it looks like President Trump told Fox News that one of the things that he's saying to Zelensky is that Russia is a big power and Ukraine is not. That sounds to me like Putin made a case to Trump that he holds the cards and a realistic deal has to be largely on Russia's terms. And I think that's what Trump is moving forward with. I think that's what he is implying with those statements, and that he expects Zelensky to take the deal, at least as far as land swaps. And I suspect as well that Trump probably is sympathetic to the idea of promising Russia that Ukraine will not be able to enter NATO. The United States can certainly rescind the invitation George W. Bush made to them in 2007 to join NATO. Any new member needs unanimous backing. So any NATO member can block that. And if the United States says that there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine, there won't be. So I think this is where Trump and Putin have probably agreed. And I don't think these are terms that are going to sound very good to President Zelensky.
Certainly won't. And it's not just Zelensky alone. Remember, the entire EU ally network of America, NATO, all of them have been very clear that they want to be part of any discussions about the future of Ukraine, including Zelensky himself, who needs to be on the table, because you cannot decide about a country till that country is represented as well. Alison, your thoughts on these updates that are coming in, fresh developments coming in, and also a huge change in stance for Donald Trump. You know, about an hour back, we had those good optics where he said no deal till there is actually a deal. And, you know, it seemed to suggest that there is progress. But now what you're hearing is a completely different stance of the American president, that Ukraine will have to accept what's on the table.
So I think if we think about these talks, it's helpful to think about them in two tracks. One is obviously the Ukraine issue, where Trump is trying to position himself as some sort of mediator where they can get a deal between Ukraine and Russia. At the same time, it's also about the U.S.-Russian relationship, and that is a much broader spectrum than just Ukraine. The sanctions, the Caucasus, a bunch of other places and interests come into play when we think about the U.S. and Russia. What the U.S. can do, and what they're trying to do, I think, here in this case, is they have a broad framework and agreement with Russia. They've obviously agreed to certain aspects of a deal. Putin cannot walk away from Ukraine without keeping some of the territories that were gained. That's just a non-starter for him. What the U.S. can't do is tell Zelensky, you have to accept this deal. However, Ukraine requires U.S. and European financial and military support to continue their war effort. So should the U.S. again, change its stance and movement in terms of what it's willing to offer Ukrainian support, that could significantly constrain what Ukraine is able to do. The EU also would be put in the position of, how do we support Ukraine? They would actually have to put their money where their mouth is. They've given Ukraine some money this week, but that money came from frozen Russian assets, not necessarily from the EU. So it's, when we say putting the ball in their court, it is the U.S. kind of putting constraints on Ukraine and expecting different players to either follow through on what they're saying or to back off. But it is not about necessarily trying to coerce from Ukraine, but to try to end the conflict in a way that works for U.S. interests and Russian interests.
19% of Ukraine is under Russian control right now. 19%. Some very large regions. there is Crimea, there is Kherson, there is Donbass and several others. For territorial swap to happen, for any deal to happen, if the condition is that Ukraine will have to give up all or some part of this territory, then it's all set to be a deal breaker. What happens then is what we are going to now focus on, and what could be the roadmap in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We will now focus on that after this very short break. Viewers, stay with us. Viewers, our big story continues to be the Alaska summit. The ice has broken between America and Russia. There's been the first time in a decade the Russian president is on American soil. Warm greetings, red carpet welcome. The two leaders exchanged handshakes, they shared laughs, and they spoke the longest they have on a face-to-face meeting, surpassed the previous time they spoke in Helsinki in 2018. Now, has this laid the groundwork for how the Russia-Ukraine conflict will end, or has this laid the groundwork for how Russia-America relationship will now look during the Trump administration for the remainder part of his term, where he's focused on trade, he's focused on critical minerals to be a key aspect of America's relationship with Russia. But the big story, the big update that's come in now, that hours after the summit ended, actually just about a little after an hour the summit ended, President Trump has told an American network that it's now up to Zelensky to take the deal. Now, what's this deal that is in the offing? We don't know. The contours of that hasn't been publicly shared, but it could be the land swap deal. Those are visuals that you're seeing on your screens right now, where earlier when he arrived, the two leaders arrived for the summit venue, they rode in Trump's Beast. Those are visuals that came in earlier. Let's get in both Alison and Michelle for more on this. We've been speaking about what could be the potential roadmap or a potential ceasefire deal or agreement that would end the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But the tone, the tenor, the messaging that's come from Donald Trump indicates that the onus will lie solely on Ukraine to accept a deal that it may not do so, given that it would involve a very large amount of its territory going away from it forever and coming under Russian control. Does that mean that we've come back to where we started in terms of 3.5 years later? It's pretty much a deal breaker, Michelle.
You could say we've come back to where we started, but there's a big difference, which is who's in the White House and what their disposition towards Russia is. Donald Trump obviously is much more friendly towards Vladimir Putin than Joe Biden was. I think there were some opportunities under Biden before the situation got to this point where there were some chances for off-ramps that Biden did not take that are not really either available to Trump or that Trump wouldn't be interested in any case. I think what we're looking at right now, the word is that Russia is planning a new offensive next month, and if indeed they launch one, Ukraine is going to need significant assistance of the kind that Biden, toward the end of his term, had a very, very hard time getting through the Republican Congress. Eventually, he did, but Trump is not going to be inclined to towards that kind of assistance to Ukraine, and he certainly isn't going to have a Congress that's going to push him on it. Mm-hmm. So this is, again, I think this comes back to the question of what Trump said about really Russia being the big power and Ukraine not being a big power, implying that Russia really holds the strategic advantage. And I think Trump is basically saying, look, you don't have the hand to play, something that he said to Zelensky months ago in the White House. And this is an indication.
But since then, Donald Trump's messaging and view with regard to Ukraine has also changed. It also went through a complete cycle from, throwing out Zelensky for not showing enough gratitude in the Oval Office. The lunch was also cancelled, to arming Ukraine with Patriot missiles, and then coming out with its hardening posture against Russia, whether it's secondary sanctions or whether it's several others. It also imposed, the Trump administration imposed fresh 25% additional tariffs on India for importing Russian oil. All that is part of the frustration that Donald Trump felt on not being able to close a deal. Now, after that is when the summit takes place today. And then just hours after the summit ended, it is now the messaging which is Ukraine's got to accept a deal that may just be too much of a red flag. Now, Alison, given the fact that there is no ceasefire, given the fact that there is no end in terms of hostilities, given the fact that Russia has a certain military momentum going in its favor, this kind of posture by Donald Trump is going to further embolden Russian forces, and would that have an impact in terms of how things unfold on ground from a military assault point of view, and also in terms of a final peace formula?
So, as we've seen already, anytime the U.S. has serious talks like these with Russia, Russia will accompany that with a military push or offensive. And that did occur while Trump and Putin were speaking. So part of this is also Russia's move to help, to this idea of Russia being a stronger player, of trying to negotiate. If we think of all of the different moves that Trump has done against Ukraine or against Russia or Russia's military offensives, those are all things that can be done to improve negotiating posture and position. What we have seen over the course of the last 3 years with Ukraine is that the Russian advancements militarily have been fairly slow, and that they have not really been able to conduct any type of offensive that would be a critical blow to Ukraine such that they could end the conflict militarily. So while these talks may encourage Russia to continue their operations because they have to for maintaining their posture, negotiations, and talks, what we've also seen militarily from Russia is that they're not in a position right now to do any type of offensive that would create a major change in the battle space in Ukraine anytime in the near future, such that Ukraine would have no choice but to either surrender or accept a deal.
All right. A quick break. I return on the other side and continue this big story. Stay with us, Mitchell and Alison. Viewers, the big story that NDTV has been focusing on, the ICE summit, the Alaska summit in Anchorage has broken ice between Russia and America. But the ceasefire, a deal, the roadmap to ending the Ukraine-Russia conflict remains elusive. No clarity on when, if that will happen. All we know is that there is a possibility of a second summit that may take place in Moscow. That's what Vladimir Putin proposed, mind you, in English for the world to understand and acknowledge that it was the Russian president offering Moscow as a potential venue for the second summit, with Donald Trump first saying that he's going to get a lot of flack or heat for it, but then said he could work around it. Does that mean that the two leaders will meet next in Moscow, or is this yet another instance of good optics that's been at play? Visuals we are putting out showing you instances of smiles, of handshakes, even as the elusive deal continues to be a bit of a problem. Updates have come in since then, where Donald Trump has given out an interview to an American network saying very clearly that now Ukraine needs to accept a deal. Now, what is that deal? The best deal that is on the table from Russia's point of view is that it gets to hold on to whatever Ukrainian territory it has been able to get in the last 3.5 years. That's 19% of the total landmass of Ukraine. Will Zelensky agree to that? Will the EU allies agree to that? Will NATO agree to that? The answer to that is going to be a vehement no, and that tells you that is it a deal breaker. Let's go back to Alison and Mitchell, who continue to be with me on the broadcast. Now, this is a question I throw open to both of you. We've seen a lot of optics at play. We've seen a lot of grand gestures, warm handshakes. All of that is there at play. But essentially, there is no peace formula. Where do we go from here beyond this big messaging that now Donald Trump is doing to Zelensky? Where does the world go from here? Where does the Ukraine-Russia conflict go from here? Mitchell, start first. Yeah.
Well, okay. I think we're going to a place where right now Trump and Putin have now rewarmed their relationship after, as you pointed out, a sort of rough patch where Trump got very angry and took some steps against Ukraine, against Putin. But I think we are not. I never really believed, I have to say, that a deal was going to come out of this meeting or any meeting anytime soon. I think a deal that ends this war is going to be an involved process that has to be directly involving both Ukraine and Russia, as well as Europe and the United States. That's not what we're seeing right now. So I don't see this being resolved. I do see the problem becoming more and more entrenched and more dangerous, frankly, for Ukraine as U.S. support for Ukraine becomes more and more tenuous. Once again, I go back to the fact that I don't see the United States coming up with the massive kind of aid packages that have been required for just to sustain their losses at the level that they've already experienced them and not to lose more. So I think Ukraine is going to feel that its back is against the wall. They're going to turn to Europe. And the real question is how Europe decides to respond to this, because the only way Ukraine is going to have options is if Europe is willing to really step up in a way they have not, and I'm not sure they're even able to, but they certainly have not done so far.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, which also brings me to ask Alison this question about, here in India, here in New Delhi, we've been wondering as to why is it that Donald Trump just woke up one day and decided to impose additional 25% tariffs on importing Russian oil. India is not the only one, most certainly not the largest one, to be importing Russian oil. Many people try to say that it could be because of his growing frustration of not being able to close a deal with Vladimir Putin, and which is why he decided to impose these additional tariffs on India for importing Russian oil. Now, the question is, with no secondary sanctions being imposed afresh, though there was threat of it, do you think that there will now be further change in tack going forward in terms of how the Trump administration views Russia going forward in the wake of these fresh Bonhomme visuals and fresh threatening tone to Zelensky?
So I think the way the U.S. views Russia hasn't changed too much, but the way they've used how they can collaborate and move forward has changed. And if they have been able to reach some sort of broad spectrum agreements on certain critical issues for that bilateral and trilateral relationship with Ukraine, then there's this idea that they can move forward. In particular, with the case of India, I do think that a large part of the sanctions were due to this idea of trying to make an example out of India because of its role of being a strategic U.S. partner, because of its role of being a strategic Russian partner, sending that message.
I disagree, and I disagree very strongly.
Okay.
Which is that, this business of trying to make an example out of India is not going to work, because this also just exposes American hypocrisy. The fact that you tried to do this with China, it came back. They've also imposed their fresh tariffs on America. There's not a word on EU because you cannot do anything about it. EU imports the maximum amount of Russian oil and natural gas as well. So this just exposes hypocrisy on the Trump administration's part, and also the fact that India has responded. We are not going to agree to any trade deal till the time it is on our terms. It's as simple as that. So I take the part in terms of how this is likely to shape up the Trump administration's view going forward, but I disagree on the statement that you made with regard to India. On that note, stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. We return with more updates and developments on this big story that we are tracking. Stay with us, viewers.